Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Skomorowsky, author of The Carriers, What the Fragile X Gene Reveals About Family, Heredity, and Scientific Discovery. It was released in March by the Columbia University Press. And is a clinical instructor in psychiatry at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine and attending psychiatrist at NYU, I'm going to say Langone, but it might be Langone Hospital. She's also a contributor to a psychodynamic understanding of modern medicine, another fascinating topic. Anne's work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Scientific American, among other periodicals. So, fragility and carriers has a specific meaning in the layperson's mind. You know, a carrier to us may be the postman, and fragile may be represented by the ubiquitous red and white sticker on a box, the meaning of which is generally ignored by the carrier. Carrier may also mean common carrier, which the Fragile X is not really. And fragility also reminds us of brittle, easily broken things, you know, thin wine glasses or tiles or porcelain, even fragile personalities. But Fragile X is a site on a specific point on a specific chromosome that is kind of pinched, seems about to fall off. It's different than our other chromosomes, which are thicker and are firmly attached. This fragility leads to a very bad situation. Those affected by it, and it's a very small portion of our population, may exhibit such bad, not good problems such as flaccid muscles, large ears, speech impediments, enlarged heads, flat feet, and a lot of intellectual and other disabilities that kind of also appear in the autism spectrum. And, you know, that leads us to its causation, the families that are affected by it, and science that discovered the whole thing in the first place. And in terms of content that are accessible to the lay reader, explicates the process of acquisition and the ripple effects for not only the sufferers, but the carriers, the family, and even communities that are affected, and even Anne's family. So thanks, Anne, for joining us today.
You're welcome. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So, you know, as a bookseller, you know, I'm fascinated by covers. And do you have a copy of the book there you can hold up? I do.
I do.
Okay.
Can you see it?
I can see it. And the thing about it is that it's almost an inevitable cover because it describes exactly what the book is talking about. So a good way to start, I guess, would be talk about what we see here. And also the main picture is one that appears throughout the book. And anytime you look up Fragile X, that's the picture you see. But talk about the fragility of it, and then the way that you put the blocks and the circles around that.
Sure. I'd be happy to talk about that. I'm not sure if I'm holding it up in a way that people can see.
Closer to your face and a little up. Okay. There you go. Perfect.
Okay. So what you see, first of all, you know, the blue or teal X is a representation of the X chromosome. And humans have 46 chromosomes, and 2 of them are sex chromosomes, which are called X and Y. And they're called the sex chromosomes because they determine what sex a baby is. And there are some exceptions, but for the most part, anybody who's female is born with 2 X chromosomes, and anyone who's male is born with an X and a Y chromosome. So these are special chromosomes that regulate something that's very important to all of us. Fragile X syndrome is due to a mutation that just happens to be on the X chromosome. And the mutation causes something called a fragile site to appear on the chromosome. And the fragile site is like a little pinch. And you can see the little pinch to ends of the chromosome on the drawing. That that's what an X chromosome with Fragile X actually looks like if it's photographed with an electron microscope and blown up. And people who have Fragile X syndrome have this little tiny constricted area. People who don't have Fragile X syndrome have basically what looks like the top. They have a, all ends of the X are unpinched. And the background that the X appears on is what's called a genogram or a pedigree. And it represents the family members of the person with Fragile X syndrome and the people who are carriers of Fragile X syndrome. So in genograms, males are represented by squares and females are represented by circles. So here's a father and a mother. The father is a carrier, the mother is not. They come together and produce a bunch of children. In the case of Fragile X syndrome, because the father is a carrier, all of the daughters, all of these circles down here are also carriers, and the sons are not carriers. Here's a square that represents this guy's son, and he has no coloration in his box. That means he's not affected by Fragile X. And it goes on through generations. And the interesting thing about Fragile X inheritance, and something I talk about a lot in the book, is how you start up here with one guy who's a carrier of Fragile X syndrome, and then down here, several generations later, you see a whole generation basically is affected by Fragile X. All these filled in squares and circles are people with Fragile X syndrome, and these two over here are carriers.
It was interesting that, and lay people will know this because they remember it from junior high or high school, is talking about Mendel. And maybe if you explain how Mendel, or basically why that helps in an understanding of Fragile X.
Why Mendel's?
Yeah.
Okay, so Mendel discovered the basic laws of genetics, and essentially that first of all, the traits are inherited physically, that there's a like an actual piece of matter that carries the traits from one generation to the next. Like if you think back, it's not necessarily self-evident that that would be the case. People used to have children and their children would have blue eyes like they did, but nobody knew that that was because a little thing called a gene was actually physically going from the parent's body into the child's body. So Mendel was one who basically discovered, he didn't discover the gene himself, but he discovered the idea of the gene. His laws explained how things are inherited in either a recessive or a dominant fashion, meaning that in the case of a recessive genetic disease, both parents have to be carriers of the disease, whereas in a dominant fashion, only one parent has to be a carrier of a disease. And it's super complicated, and you have to go halfway through the book to get to the part where the explanations become clear. So I'm not sure how I can really quickly summarize it, but there are ways in which Fragile X syndrome is different from other Mendelian disorders. It's inherited in a different way, and that's one of the things that has made it so interesting and so hard to study.
Well, let's go forward then a little bit, which will also help, to how this was identified. And in so doing, I'm fascinated by the fact that the Martin-Bell syndrome, you don't often see this, the name was changed to this non-personal kind of name, like Crohn's disease. It's Crohn's disease, and that's exactly what you see. But it's a fascinating story, and not just because of how it was discovered, but also because Julia Bell did it, and she lived to 80, and she wrote a paper when she lived to be like almost 100.
She lived to be 100.
Yeah, and she wrote that paper when she was 80 about rubella.
Mm-hmm.
And you spend some time talking about the women, I thought of Watson Crick, about the women behind these guys who generally were kind of tossed away, and you give a little history of university and all that. But talk a little bit about, since we're talking about Mendel, talk a little bit about the Martin-Bell syndrome, which was Fragile X, how it was discovered, and then how we got to the point where it became Fragile X.
Sure. So Julia Bell was going to college around the turn of the 20th century, in the early 20th century. And she was one of what were known as steamboat ladies. Steamboat ladies were young women who were going to women's colleges at Cambridge and Oxford in England. And Cambridge and Oxford had these colleges for women, but they wouldn't give women degrees. However, over in Dublin, Trinity College would give women degrees. So when a woman graduated from Cambridge, she could take a steamboat over to Trinity to, in Dublin, to pick up her degree. And so college young women who graduated from Cambridge and Oxford became known as steamboat ladies. And obviously they had to overcome a great deal of sexism to get their degrees and to pursue careers in science. She later became a medical doctor, and she was a very curious person with a lively mind. And she loved literature. She loved reading. I guess you could say she was an avid reader. She liked to look things up. She liked to go into archives and to satisfy her curiosity in all sorts of ways. And so she also was from a very large family. She was one of 14 siblings, and she was interested in children. And she was approached by a woman, an English woman, who had come to her and said, I'm very concerned. My sister's sons have intellectual disability, and I'm worried about my son. I think he has intellectual disability. So Julia Bell was curious about this situation, and she went and started interviewing members of this family and discovered this pattern. And the pattern was that women, mothers, would generally not be affected by intellectual disability, but their sons were. And she understood, because of her earlier work on different conditions, that meant that the mutation that caused this intellectual disability was probably on the X chromosome. So she basically used, even though she couldn't, use DNA sequencing or anything like that. DNA hadn't even been discovered, but she used her brain and her knowledge, her ability to work with statistics, and also her compassion for these mothers who had come to see her and were struggling, and going out to the country and taking a family history from women who were struggling to raise kids with intellectual disability. She was able to put together family stories in a way that hadn't been done before. And the syndrome that she then described with her collaborator, Martin, became known as Martin-Bell syndrome.
It was one of the things that really surprised me. And I go, afterwards, I went, oh, now I understand, because women do not generally exhibit these symptoms of Fragile X. And it was fascinating that, since they have two X's, it's like one X is kind of problematic and the other X says, uh-oh, we need some help.
Right.
And it kind of says, okay, we'll fix this up, even though this other X is screwed up. Talk a little bit about that, because that was really fascinating.
Sure. So what I was saying earlier about the sex chromosomes is that women have two X chromosomes. That's what determines biologically if you're a woman. Men have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome, and it's the Y chromosome that starts off producing testosterone in the growing fetus and basically makes the, up until that point, sexless fetus start turning into a boy. So when a woman has a defect on her X chromosome, she's got another X chromosome that can do what chromosomes need to do and supply proteins that the body needs to be healthy. When a man has a defect on his X chromosome, he doesn't have another X chromosome, he has another Y chromosome, and the Y can't replace the X. So X-linked diseases, it's a little counterintuitive because you think of, oh, women have more X's, therefore they would be more sick. It's actually the opposite. The spare X helps women have, be healthier and be carriers, basically, who are unaffected. Whereas having just one damaged X makes men more likely to have an X-linked disease.
In the past couple of months, for whatever serendipity, I've interviewed so many scientists and neuroscientists who deal with the idea of consciousness and awareness of their own existence. And I think again, I keep saying this, but as a layman, and the thing is, you've made this very accessible for a layperson. It's just this tiny little thing, just a pinch that changes so much. Even the part about enlarged testicles. I mean, you take all this panoply of symptoms, and made me think and because remember the guy who, one of the three sons, who was the coal miner, and he thought all he could say was black.
Right.
I'm thinking of consciousness, and this little tiny thing is able to affect your own awareness of your existence and things like that. How is it possible that just this Fragile X, which has some symptoms, how it manifests itself throughout the body and the mind? Because it's tiny.
That's the thing that's so cool about genetic diseases, is that just like one tiny change in a person's DNA can have a huge impact. And the way Fragile X affects people in such a dramatic way is by inhibiting the production of a protein, which is called FMRP, which used to stand for the Fragile X mental retardation protein, but the mental retardation has fortunately just very recently, in the past month, been eliminated from the word FMRP in a nod to the fact that we don't use that expression anymore. But the protein is necessary for normal development of the brain. And we all have FMRP. We all need FMRP to be alive. And people with Fragile X syndrome have defects in their FMRP are not able to develop normally, starting from the point where they're fetuses, and throughout life.
So if you get to the more complicated stuff, which again, you explicate very well, talk a little bit more about FMR, and the fascinating part of that is coupled with that is the CGG repeats and adding up the repeats. And no one's going to understand that unless you explain it like you did, about why there's a number that's a gray area.
Yeah.
Like that. If you could explain that a little bit.
So yes, this is what differentiates people. Let's just, for the sake of argument, let's just say there's three types of people. There's normal people who don't have any Fragile X disorder. They have normal X chromosomes. That's not to say that anybody's really normal, but we're just going to use that to make things clearer. There's people who have Fragile X syndrome who probably have severe intellectual disability and behavioral problems. And then there are the people that my book focuses on, which those people are carriers. So those are the mothers and fathers of people with Fragile X syndrome. They're the people who have the half circle in the cover, and the half square. So those are people who look like everyone else. They look totally normal, and yet they're carrying this mysterious and devastating condition, Fragile X syndrome. How are they carrying it? They're carrying it in a specific way, in that they have at the beginning of their gene, the gene that makes FMRP, they have a bunch of what used to be thought of as nonsense, like completely unimportant bits of DNA that are called CGG repeats. CGG stands for certain types of base pairs in DNA. Everybody has about 30 CGG repeats. People who have Fragile X syndrome have over 200 CGG repeats, and people in the middle are carriers. The thing about being a carrier is that over generations, carriers pass on more and more repeats to their kids. So I might have 75 CGG repeats. My kid might have 125, and their kid might have 250. The kid with 250 is going to have Fragile X syndrome because he has more than 200 repeats. Me and the kid with 125 are carriers, and most likely we don't know we're carriers because we feel completely normal.
This may be a bad metaphor analogy, but you have a record, a vinyl record, and then you have a CD. The CD uses ones and zeros. There may be a little gap between the ones and zeros, but it's never going to degrade. Whereas a vinyl record, every time you play it, the information is somewhat lost because it's analog. And is it like that? Is it degraded? Does it become blurred in a sense? It's probably a
wow. I'm soaking in that metaphor. I wouldn't say it's degraded, but I would say that, well, what they call it is that the mutation expands, the CGG repeat gets longer. So I guess that's a form of degradation. I that's basically accurate.
Another aspect of that is when it can be discovered by testing. I read stuff about chorionic villus when I was, and then amniocentesis and stuff like that. And given the Supreme Court leaking of the Roe versus Wade opinion, if indeed it happens, which it's going to, what kind of testing and how early can it be determined? And then what do you do when you find out?
Well, that is a super interesting question. And I think that's going to be a real, I don't even know what, a lot of unprintable words come to mind about what is going to happen should that come to pass. Part of the difficulty right now that we have with prenatal testing for Fragile X is that prenatal testing pretty much tests the mom. We don't routinely test fetuses or babies for Fragile X. We test mothers to see if they are carriers. And if they find out they're carriers, then they might go on to have testing of their fetus. And there's two ways you can do the testing of the fetus. And one is chorionic villus sampling, which can be done at around 12 weeks. And the other is amniocentesis, which can't be done until around 16 or 18 weeks. So if you're living in a state that decides, how late an abortion would be acceptable, you might or might not change your desired early test for Fragile X. That's assuming that anyone who tested positive would want to have an abortion if they found out that their child had Fragile X syndrome. And that's a question that obviously needs to be left to each individual.
I guess kind of a three-part question would be, one, talking about the village where pretty much a much greater population had Fragile X and why. And then I guess go on to what, a lot of, you say you haven't had any interviews, but you've talked about that and you had a written interview, and then talk about how it affected how it affects your family. So first talk about, this village where not everybody, but a lot of people have it, and then your own family and what your trepidation, if there is any,
Well, I write about this village in the book, and I learned about the village from this guy Wilmar, who I write about in the book, who essentially brought this very tiny off the map village in Colombia to the attention of American researchers.
Not to interrupt you,
Yes.
but he seems like such a wonderful person.
He's an incredible guy. I'm glad you said that, because it means that the warmth that I felt towards him comes across in the book. He's a really amazing person. And he took an interest in this village that he knew about from personal experience, because his grandfather lived nearby, and he would go to church with his grandfather and see these funny looking people in church. And this village became famous, and it was known as basically the town of the bobitos, which means fools, or something derogatory, frankly. But that's what it was called locally. Wilmar became a doctor, and while he was in medical school, he was able to see pictures of folks with Fragile X syndrome in textbooks, and thought, I think that these are the bobitos who are living in this village, and was able to forge relationships with folks who lived in the village and get them to be tested, and indeed they had Fragile X syndrome.
Oh yeah, so you said he brought it to the attention.
Yeah.
Go on before I interrupted you.
So he got connected with these American researchers through a young Colombian American social worker who had family in Colombia who had Fragile X syndrome, were known to have it, but were not really getting the treatment that they needed there. The two of them came together and brought this community to the attention of these American researchers at what's called the Mind Institute at the University of California. And that's how it was able to come to my attention, was through the Mind Institute.
Sometimes I just go off on segues that have nothing to do.
That's cool.
So I was thinking of when you talk about the Human Genome Project,
Mm-hmm.
and then you said it was self-congratulatory. Are you thinking of that guy? What's his name? Ventner? Because he was always boasting.
I wasn't necessarily thinking of anyone specific, but of how there's been so much kind of hoorah about the Human Genome Project. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book is to talk about how non-technical interventions have been so important in genetics, like just starting with Julia Bell, going to the country, taking pictures, meeting moms, talking with them about their families. That's how Martin Bell syndrome, which was later came to be called Fragile X, that's how it was discovered. It wasn't discovered by lab scientists. So one of the things that I thought was so exciting about Wilmar's work was he was like a field worker. He went from house to house. He interviewed every single person in this village. He went to the library and looked up land deeds. His boots were on the ground. He wasn't working in a laboratory to make these discoveries. So I think, obviously we all know that genetic medicine has made a huge contribution, but I think that the passion of researchers and the passion of families who are affected by conditions like these is maybe even more important to uncover scientific secrets. It's people's curiosity and excuse me, willingness that really leads to these scientific discoveries.
Again, going off topic or back to where we were talking again with Julia Bell, I was just thinking her 5-volume treasury, which is a great name for it. That's exactly what you're talking about. She didn't need to go into electron microscopes to figure out what she figured out. And that, that 5 volumes is like her life must have been, she did more in a week than I've done in the past 10 years.
She was an amazing woman. Yeah, I agree.
Well, the other thing is, and this is something, again, that people remember from their studies in either college or maybe graduate school, is when you talk about the building blocks. It's very interesting that you go from this pinch to building blocks, and then you talk about, and you do your own analogy, you talk about, and we all kind of know what RNA is, the messenger concept. But when you talk about transcription versus translation, that may be hard for people to understand, except for the fact that you use that music analogy, which really helped.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good.
Yeah, talk a little about that.
Sure. So so Watson and Crick famously discovered DNA, and they developed a concept which was so important now in genetics that they called it the central dogma. And what is meant by the central dogma is that RNA, that DNA is a bunch of molecules that basically contain the template for forming RNA. RNA then helps pull together different amino acids, which are the building blocks that form proteins. And proteins are then made basically in this order, DNA to RNA to protein. And proteins are the things that control what happens in our bodies. You might not think of protein that way, but for example, FMRP is a protein, and the protein is what is helping our brain adapt to the outside world and to learn and to grow. So the central dogma is that the sequence of construction of our bodies is DNA to RNA to protein. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And again, well, yes, it does, because of the music analogy. So that's what I wanted you to talk about.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the music analogy is that the DNA is like a piece of music that's been written down. So it's notes on a, I'm trying to remember what that 5-line thing is called that the notes are on.
Oh, like the something staff, or that's not what it is. Well, be that as it may, go ahead.
Okay. So DNA is like a written piece of music, and a written piece of music can be transcribed to be played by one instrument or another. So you can write a song like let's say on your guitar, and it can then be transcribed to be played by a whole orchestra. Then the translation happens when the transcribed piece of music is actually played by musical instruments and becomes a piece of music.
Well, suppose I am listening to a symphony, Mozart, Jupiter Symphony, or the Host of Planets, and one player makes a little mistake. The conductor knows it, and he's really upset, and he'll maybe chastise the person after the performance, but the audience may not even know it all.
That's right. That's right. And there are a lot of mutations that are just not important.
Exactly. That's what I was trying to understand. And that's really hard to understand, because the tiniest thing can happen and it might just be nothing. We would never notice it. Or maybe there is one tiny symptom of it. But here, is it because of the fragility? If there was the same kind of fragility on another chromosome, would it also cause a panoply? Or that's what I kind of still don't understand.
I mean, I think Fragile X is pretty unusual. There are a few diseases that are characterized by these fragile sites, and they're mostly diseases that are movement related, like Huntington's disease. There's something called spinal muscular atrophy. So the fragile sites are not common. The thing about the fragile site and Fragile X syndrome is it's the fragile site, you know, it's got a very striking appearance, and that's why the condition is called the Fragile X syndrome, and it looks fragile, and that's it. You know, it's cool. It's memorable, but it's not. The problem is not really that the chromosome itself is fragile. The problem is that the defect in the gene causes that little pinch to happen. In other words, they're associated, but it's not that the chromosome is falling apart that is the problem. It's that the gene that if the gene were functioning properly, the chromosome wouldn't look like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's like I said before, and it's not like criticizing you at all. It's just that the cover is the easiest way to understand what is happening. It's so demonstrative, isn't it?
Yes.
But like anything else, like if you look at that picture that you've seen everywhere of the COVID virus, you know,
yes,
it's burned into my mind.
Sure.
But those are all analogies too. It doesn't really look like that because there isn't really anything to look at. It's just that it's just like when you see a picture of a nebula that's really a radio wave that's been or sound of wind on Mars, things like that. But what, you know, it doesn't really look like it. It doesn't really look like that. How can you actually, under an electron microscope, it looks exactly like that, right?
Yeah. You know, I was about to launch into something about the COVID molecule, but I'm going to restrain myself because it's really not something I know anything about. But the thing with the X chromosome does look like that when somebody has Fragile X syndrome. That's an accurate picture. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not that the problems in Fragile X syndrome are not caused by the fact that the Fragile X molecule looks fragile or actually is physically fragile. The problem is that the missing the mutation causes it to look like that. It's not that the fragility itself is a problem.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that reminds me. When we were talking about the village, the second part of my question, which I maybe I didn't really say, is about, and it's, you know, the introduction is by, I guess she's a really good friend of yours. It's a great introduction, right? Randy Hagerman.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah, and you put her in the acknowledgments almost first, maybe first.
Yeah, she's an incredible person. And the most important thing that she did for me, besides be a friend and sort of a mentor in my studying this topic, is introduce me to patients who are mostly so grateful to her that they were willing to, you know, really talk to me about their lives.
Yeah, and that was definitely understood in the fort, which was the way she wrote it was a great introduction. So, and I guess jumping off from that is, oh yes, so we still haven't gotten to you. We keep trying to get to you, but we haven't done it yet.
Well, let me say something about the family involvement. I do have family members who are affected by the carrier state. I'm sorry to say that they haven't given me permission to talk about it. And so I'm not going to be able to. I can tell you that this work has been very personal to me.
Yeah.
And I do talk in the book about myself being tested to see if I'm a carrier of a mutation. And I was lucky to find out that I'm not. And some of the things that I went through in learning about that and the things that I thought about, I feel a little, I'm sorry about that, because I thought it was very brave of the people I spoke to allow me to speak so intimately about their lives in my book. And I wish I could do the same about my family, but I'm respecting their wishes.
But you did say, and I don't like, I wouldn't call it a spoiler, but I don't want to give anything away. But you did say that it kind of opened up some doors for you that had previously been closed. Like it made you think about the past and your family and things that you may have not noticed.
Yeah, absolutely.
What kind of things?
Behaviors of people that I had noticed that seemed, in retrospect, they seemed like they might be symptoms of the carrier condition.
Yeah. I guess which brings me to my last question, and we can conclude this way, is that, okay, here's this book that explains something very important. So I guess, what do you want the reader to take away? And, which I don't think there is there anything that can ameliorate or get rid of this, for want of a better word, so that it no longer is a peril that people might have to face in their lives and know about it before it occurs?
Well, what I hoped that people would take away from it are a couple of different things. I mean, I hoped that the book would be informative for people who are looking for information about Fragile X, and more specifically about carriers of Fragile X who were thought to have no symptoms until recently. And I wanted to tell some of their stories because I believe that they do have symptoms, and science supports that. So I wanted that information to be available to people who are carriers and people who are struggling with what to do with that knowledge. I think more and more young women are learning that they're carriers through prenatal testing, and then they don't know what to do with that information because the information is not readily available. The other thing that I really hope to do was draw attention to this idea that we touched on earlier about the human factor in science and medicine, and how important the scientists' personal interests, background, personality, and determination are in making scientific discoveries. And that's a sort of different topic. And I really wanted the book to be a blend of information for people who are just interested in science and for people who are more specifically interested in Fragile X. In terms of treatment, there isn't much, to be honest, although there's a great deal of work, and Dr. Rondi Hagerman's introduction reflects on this more than I do in the book. There's a great deal of work in developing treatments for Fragile X and also for the Fragile X carrier symptoms. But for right now, we have kind of the usual suspects for behavioral issues, medications for depression, for anxiety. There are medications to treat tremor. There are medications to treat infertility. There are processes to treat infertility. So I would strongly encourage anyone who's affected by any of these to meet with a genetic counselor and to meet with somebody who has expertise in Fragile X to learn more. In fact, if you don't mind, I'd like to just put a plug in for the National Fragile X Foundation, which has an amazing website, and it's NFXF for National Fragile X Foundation, nfxf.org, which is a huge wealth of information available to people who are looking to get connected with appropriate services.
Yeah, I guess listening to you just now, I guess the primary reason is that you've allowed us to have a certain type of awareness that otherwise you wouldn't have had at all. In almost all situations, you would have no idea why this happened, and the doctor who's treating you may not know either if there's no testing, or may not know enough to know that that's what it is.
Right.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered it quite well. And the one thing, again, as a bookstore owner, and I say this in every single interview, people say you can't judge a book by its cover, but everyone who comes into my store does. And that's why I said the cover was inevitable, because I think it's an excellent And all, I go off on things, but the main reason why it's so effective is because, as I said earlier, I almost can't believe it. It's this tiny, tiny little pinch,
Mhm.
and it's just, and I know we haven't gotten to the point where we can manipulate genes, and maybe we'll never get to that point. But if you're talking about awareness and you see the X, and you see that pinch, it really brings home, and the subtitle as well, really
Mhm.
brings home. So it'll be on our, oh no, it isn't, it'll be on our front desk. It is, and our front table. So we look
Fantastic.
forward. And thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
Okay, hopefully we'll talk again soon when you write your next book.
Okay.
Okay,
Thanks.
bye-bye.